Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another War Report. Now, this is a bit of an addition to this week's episode, and I do apologize for some of the technical issues at the beginning. As I'm sure you all know, all the longtime viewers know, my internet is barely functional at best. Now, I have things more or less functional now, but please bear with us if there's any technical difficulties. And once again, I apologize for some of the stuff at the beginning of last episode, and thank you for those of you who stuck through it because we covered a lot of ground on that. But we just wanted to get over a few things that we didn't quite get to touch on because of the length of that one article that we covered last episode. And the primary one with that would be Brazil. So, Brazil has its own, I guess people were equivocating it to the January 6th movement, and even down to the shaman storming the federal buildings in Brazil. Now, there are a lot of unanswered questions about this. This was something that was very briefly in the media and then disappeared. Even in terms of the outrage cycle that you would get somewhere out of, say, like a CNN or an MSNBC, or people who would be really outraged about a Trump-aligned politician in Brazil is trying his own subversion of democracy, as it were, which is the narrative that they tried to spin at first before it just fell completely off the radar. But this is, of course, all a result of Lula beating Bolsonaro in the Brazilian elections back in October. Now, a lot of people speculated when that initially happened, Bolsonaro was going to take more dictatorial actions to try to overturn the election results or try to stay in power, which, not to insult anyone in particular, not to too harshly criticize anyone in particular, I feel is a take on the situation that is very much stuck in the 1980s. The idea that you still get overturning of elections and coups and juntas out of Latin America, where I'm not saying something like that is impossible, but what a lot of people seem to imply would have been something you would have seen in either the 70s or the 80s when Latin America was a very contentious battleground during the Cold War. But since the end of the Cold War, and frankly, I think the reason why we really don't even cover it that much on the show is that Latin America, while yes, there are significant nations down there, nations that have been in the spotlight, such as Venezuela with the regime change attempts a few years back, Brazil, which is an emerging player on the world stage, Argentina, which has always managed to pull its own weight. While you do have players like that in Latin America, compared to Europe, East Asia, North America, it is very much an afterthought, and it isn't even particularly a battleground of influence, say, the same way the Middle East or the Balkans or Eastern Europe or various other places may be. So it does tend to fade into the background, but with the emergence of BRICS in 2022, I do think it warrants a bit more discussion than there was unrest in a Latin American nation. Because, number one, we're talking about the largest nation in South America, both by population and land area. We're talking about a major economic player on the world stage, and a country that has pretty strong ties with some of the most powerful countries in the world, whether that be the United States, China, Russia. So there's actually a lot we can get into here between Bolsonaro and Lula and the dynamics between them, and just the direction that Brazil may take going forward. And a lot of it, of course, is going to be speculation because even with this event being about a week since, there's still that not that much that has been told about it. But I suppose if you would like to give some thoughts on it, I'll
Yeah.
hand it over to you.
Well, I mean, there were some very strange things about this. The fact that, as you say, um, it seemed almost like an entire repeat of the January 6th riots at the Capitol in the US, um, just separated by 2 days. Um, Bolsonaro had come to the States, however, and he too was pictured eating at Kentucky Fried Chickens, as was Trump eating Kentucky Fried Chicken on his private jet, flying away from the Capitol. I don't recall. I think he was going to Mar-a-Lago. Um, but if you've been following the whole thing, we had a show where we discussed the enormous efforts by the political left wing class of Brazil, um, who, by the way, the U.S. Democrats are highly invested in, um, suppressed all kinds of um advertising in favor of Bolsonaro before the election. Everything that you would, prior to the 20, it was obviously a demonstration of that is unelected, but also power that is in many ways associated. So, you know, Bolsonaro did give some um, pretty interesting tweets all along the way. But the last one that he did was he said, "I've tried to find a solution within the Constitution, and I have not found the support that I needed." So, in a way, he doesn't answer his own question. And what he's saying is, look, there are not enough elites in Brazil that can turn this around, because I believe it was in 1983. You had, conservative Brazilians who camped out, and they did it again this time. Who camped out at the army military bases? They just like camped out there, and and asked them to take over, and which happened. And I agree with you that a right wing government during the 70s and 80s for the U.S. in the Cold War was something more favorable, right? Uh, but after the Soviet Union, that is not the kind of alignment that Americans want, and this is also why Bolsonaro was demonized by every single sort of victim group that people are aware in the West, particularly if you live in North America. So, including native Brazilians, who, by the way, are kind of in favor of I forget his name, but he's a wealthy billionaire in Brazil to basically take over and help them, get some kind of economic prosperity going, which, for the libs would basically mean compromising the rainforest and so on and so on. But the fact is these people, they don't want to live in uh, a Westerner's romantic idea of natives. They don't. And we'll never know just the amount of changes like that could have been implemented. Would they just have I don't know, casinos or whatnot? Would there be something more substantial? In any case, um, the if you drill down, the natives in Brazil did actually like Bolsonaro, but Brazil is a deeply, deeply divided country. It is divided on racial grounds, not quite the same way as the U.S. is, because um, frankly, it has a larger mulatto population. There are very few people who are just pure African, but there are many people who have like significant African ancestry mixed with native, mixed with European. But there is, I guess, like India. Um, various stratas depending on how European you look. And there are parts of Brazil that are very much like that, and parts that are less like that. And that is where this tug of war is really heading. Now they have the same kind of similar, not the same, but similar kind of shit lib signaling that is anti-European stock and so on, to the point that there's criticism of Brazilians who are, let's say, high European content who want to leave Brazil because it's I'll use the refrain, a shithole. Um,
Ironically enough, many of those people of the much pure European stock are actually more recent arrivals than the founding Portuguese stock. We're talking much like somewhere like Argentina,
yeah,
German, Italians, people from Iberia that arrived later after the initial colonization period, where in a way, I don't want to delve too much into Brazilian racial politics at risk of sounding too ignorant or inflaming too many tensions. But if you look at it, with a lot of these societies in Central and South America, the mestizo population, as it were, is much more of a founding stock, and particularly with places like Brazil and Argentina, when you get those people of the much more European admixture, they are people who showed up between 1850 and 1950, and uh, so that is something to take into consideration. I think Bolsonaro himself is actually of that sort of stock, but I did
yeah,
also want.
He's German and Italian.
Yeah, I knew the surname was Italian. I didn't know he had the German ancestry to him, but I did just want to take a moment to reflect on both Bolsonaro and Lula just as figures and what they really represent. So, going all the way back to 2018, you had Bolsonaro get in. He was part of the general wave of populists that was spreading throughout the world at the time. And what he really came down on was domestic policy in Brazil.
Yep.
Now, when he actually got into office, I can't speak too much for his domestic track record because, admittedly, it is one of my blind spots. I didn't keep too much with the internal news events in Brazil throughout his tenure. But when it came to how he behaved abroad, it was actually a very inconsistent mix because he took up a very hard line on China, similar to what you would have expected from somebody like Donald Trump. And of course, between BRICS and other agreements, China and Brazil have grown closer economically in the recent years. But then he was also, in a way, much like Trump, softer on some of the European politics, with particularly Russia. He moved the embassy to Brazil. He tried to make himself a friend of, quote unquote, friend of Israel, as it were. The Israelis took a great interest in him, particularly the Likud party. In my opinion, trying to see what a future America would look like under those demographics. How does that look like? You had a man who was at least a self proclaimed Catholic for most of his life. When he gets into office, he starts hanging out with people in evangelical circles and a lot of the more Protestant convert circles that
Because
exist in Latin
that's huge
America.
in Brazil,
Yeah, they're
and
huge in
that's
Latin.
how that ties in with support for Israel.
Oh, absolutely, huge in Latin America, huge in Brazil, and these groups. I don't know if right wing is really the correct term, maybe from like a '70s, '80s standpoint,
It's
but
like
they're
an American. It's like an American '80s right wing
yeah. That's
to
how
a degree.
that's how I describe it. It's like it's it's an infatuation, I would say, with '50s to '80s Protestant white America for good and for ill, which is why you get a lot of the Zionist stuff and why you get someone like Bolsonaro identifying a lot with Trump and trying to relate to the U.S. and trying to appeal more to, once again, that perception of the U.S. from that post-war up until like the Reagan era period of that shining city on a hill type of America. And like I said, very 1980s is the way I could put that in terms of how he viewed Brazil. And that was really the core of it. But then, like I said, you got a few of the oddities there where he was critical of China, but then also stayed in BRICS and maintained cooperation with that. On the outbreak of the war, he wasn't finger wagging, he wasn't foaming at the mouth trying to condemn Russia like a lot of other major nations at the time. Took an approach much similar to India, so at the end of the day, there was a degree of pragmatism down there, so he was a strange figure to say the least. He's one of the ones that I actually have a hard time making out. It's not like one of these people, say, just take, for example, the current Italian government or some of these other populist movements that are just populist rhetoric in establishment regimes. But it's also not somebody like an Orban who is truly transgressive and actually does take a stand against the current system and actually does question things and tries to present an alternative. I wouldn't exactly say it's in between there, but I think the one thing, to repeat myself, that you could say about Bolsonaro that informed a lot of his more incoherent decisions and rhetoric was just sheer pragmatism. At the end of the day, despite everything, I think he still had some degree of Brazil's best interest in his heart, and that while I'm not saying he was a completely selfless public servant, because what politician is, I think he had a general idea of what was good for the nation and tried to pursue that. To give him credit where credit is due.
Right. And I think, he took a leaf basically out of what many so-called populist parties and leaders in Europe were doing in Europe, like Orban, to avoid direct criticism was to support uh, Netanyahu and or Israel vocally, right? That would give you the cover that you needed to, in basically the elite American globalist structure, um, that you would not be a direct challenge to the system because one of the system's concerns, of course, is Israel. But the thing is that Netanyahu, in and of itself, is a figure that um, the system can get rid of if they have to, right? In the same way that we've often said on the show that Trump was in many ways a useful pawn in this endeavor for Netanyahu. Netanyahu is also somebody that's himself replaceable. I'm not advocating for him. Like I'm not saying that the many court cases against him and his wife are invalid, but the fact is the system can clamp down hard on him when they want to get rid of him. And when the circumstances change, if he comes back, he comes back, which seems to be the case now. Um, so I think Bolsonaro played that as well as he could, but that's really like something from the Trump era, and it doesn't fly anymore. We're in a very different era. They don't care if you support Israel or not, for many reasons. Because like the indication from the U.S. is Israel doesn't need any more support, but not in the Trumpian sense, like, oh, don't worry about the Syrians. They're not going to do anything. Israel can handle it. No, we're not going to start a war for Israel and Syria. I don't mean that in that sense. I mean, what they're afraid of with Bolsonaro is any kind of meaningful right wing movement within, like, just the hemisphere, this hemisphere that includes North and South America, but in any like country that has some kind of European roots. They're deathly afraid of that. In many ways, like even the left in Brazil is as much as is the right, is a kind of imitation of the left in current America, which is it's essentially like all the global homo virtue points, gay marriage, uh, basically everything you're familiar with. Okay, uh, that's what they advocate. So if you're on Twitter and you know the Twitter accounts Sage and Just Cato, they're both Brazilians and Bolsonaro fans. You can get a lot of information from them regarding what happened. But I think in many ways, Bolsonaro leaving Brazil was a way to indicate his supporters, like, I'm not going to help you. We cannot do this. I know this worked 30 years ago, but it will not work now. And then he's come to stomach pains, which um, this
From
is
the
something that
KFC, naturally.
this is something that people forget that back when Bolsonaro was running for election, I believe that was in 2018 or maybe at the end of
Yes,
2017,
2018.
2018, right? He was stabbed in the stomach and he nearly died. And I think that's what this is about. Now, the guy who stabbed him, the court ruled that he was insane and he was freed. So that gives you kind of like an indication of just how rigged the system is in Brazil and how that resembles the system in the US, right? Because they considered this guy like, if they really wanted to, they could have arrested him and put him away for the rest of his life if they wanted to, right? Um, Now they're basically going after any of the protesters from January the 8th of this year. And we'll see what Lula does. And that kind of brings us to the next point, and that is, can Lula unify the country, which I think is absolutely impossible. No one can unify that country. Um, I think we're going to see more crazy politics like this coming out of Brazil. And Brazil has, of course, like a very large underclass that racially is not very European, that will consistently vote for anyone against anyone like Bolsonaro and for someone like Lula. Um, so I don't think Lula is going to do it. Now he has the backing of the military, so yes, on some level he will be more effective, but there will have to be a period of just basically breaking the spirit of Brazilians that are in favor of Bolsonaro, or the kind of vision that he had for for Brazil. Um, and I would suspect that you're going to see a lot of Brazilians leaving. Ironically, at my job, there is a young woman whose family just moved from Brazil a year ago. Um, Part of her family moved in a year and a half ago, and she moved in a year ago. So uh, I would say that there's going to be a lot, and maybe it's just one of those things where it's not going to change, and Brazil is headed to become like, just I don't know, like a bigger travesty than it's been. And this comes from for the reasons that I've already outlined, and it's just not going to be a coherent and functional country.
Well, it's interesting you bring that all up, especially in the context of Lula, who, if you do look at the outcome of this most recent election and the lead up to it, the American Empire, Biden, the State Department, all were very pro Lula. All seemed
Yeah,
to have wanted him to return to power. The man who ran for president from prison after his previous stint as president, in which case, really just your typical corrupt Latin American politician is the
totally corrupt.
best way you
Yeah,
could put it. And I don't mean corruption in the sense that, say, that one article we might have reviewed last episode kvetched about corruption. I mean corruption that actually leads to dysfunction within the state and its apparatuses, and it's not just your guys taking stuff off the top. Not that I'm implying that's what all corruption is, but once again, like actually detrimental, actually noticeable, because you're never going to get quote unquote corruption everywhere, but to the point where he actually went to prison for it. I'll just put it that way.
Hmm.
And what's interesting about him, despite having all this weight behind him, whether that be from the State Department, whether that be from Biden himself, whether that be from just any of the various apparatuses, he also, both in his first stint in politics and now that he has returned to politics as president, was in favor of BRICS, was in favor of furthering this cooperation. So that was something that was generally a consensus. As far as I know, there haven't been any strong condemnations of the war or Russia from Lula since the start of this, even as part of the presidential campaign. He is more in favor of China, at least was more in favor of China than Bolsonaro. How he'll actually play that out now that he's returned to office remains to be seen. But I think ultimately, and not to defend Lula, not to say that, oh, he's going to break away from the shackles of the American empire. Ultimately, the situation in Brazil right now is ideal for the risk it presents to the empire, to the regime right now. Because you have this large nation, once again, largest in Latin America in terms of population and number of people, that has quite a bit of economic weight to throw around, especially for its region, that is in an organization that is dedicated to increasing ties with Russia, China, India, among others. And it has been shown when you have two people as diametrically opposed as Bolsonaro and Lula, who are both to some degree in favor of this arrangement, the best the American empire could ask for is just complete internal division of the country. It's complete dysfunction of the country.
Yeah.
Just to have them at each other's throats rather than being a unified power block. Because, especially for a nation that doesn't have the world at the palm of its hands, say, like America. Now, America can tolerate the level of internal strife, and even it's starting to struggle to do this, but it could tolerate an increased level of strife because it had all its ducks in a row everywhere else that it could tolerate the culture war politics. When you have a nation like Brazil that actually has to play its cards far more reasonably and has a lot more to lose and a lot less to play with, they can't afford the culture war politics, so to speak, to the same degree somewhere like America or even a lot of these Western European vassals can.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point because, I had people ask me, um, do you think that there were Americans on the ground who helped this protest along? Where are the Russians? What's going on here? And my reply was basically that, look, this is an advantageous situation for the Americans, is for Brazil not to be coherent, right? One of the aces up Lula's sleeve right now will be that America, unlike in 2018, is um, firmly anti-China. And the ace up the American and Lula's sleeve is basically they can woo over some of the right by basically agreeing with one of Bolsonaro's policies towards China, right? Which, uh, so in other words, if let's say if you're talking about Russian support, they obviously support Lula. I wouldn't say it was the most fervent support I've ever seen, but they do, and might think that they have like their guy who isn't like one foot in bricks and the other foot not. Um, I don't think Lula's going to be the leader that the Russians think they're going to get. And Lula will be very compromised. The American Democrat Party will make sure of that he complies with all kinds of things.
Oh, between his history and the state that Brazil is about to enter, he is going to be very pliable. He is going to do anything the State Department
Yeah,
tells him.
right. Now you can see like you can understand American shit libs, um, they accused Trump of nearly starting World War III with China, that his economic policies are backfiring, they're not working, they're working against America, blah, 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 right? Biden goes way, way further than Trump. And the shit libs don't complain about any of that, right? All of those criticisms are gone because it's one of their own, right? Friend enemy distinction. And I suppose that the same thing will happen in Brazil because I don't think the Americans are going to tolerate close cooperation with the Lula government and China, even though that they had that arrangement. That period is gone. It's over, right? If you just look at China, China itself has changed dramatically in 5, 6 years. It really has. Um, I remember all kinds of tropes and memes about China's sort of underbelly of global homo, the popularity of some of its trans entertainers and on various social media platforms. All those people are gone. They were literally erased in the thousands by the Chinese. Um, that need for them to focus on, let's say, traditional concepts of men and women and their roles has increased. So that period is over. That represents like literally something from the Trump era, which I think
I
is
mean, just to
a
touch on
kind of
something
transition.
from about China that you were saying to bolster your point is a lot of people missed the fundamental deviation China took. I would say it was in 2017 after the CCP tried to have an internal coup and remove Xi Jinping. A lot of people
Hmm.
don't remember that. That was fall of 2017, where out of all the factions within the Chinese Communist Party, there were many who were fed up with the direction that Xi Jinping was going in and wanted to return to more of the, say, the Chimerica arrangement and
Yep.
the Shanghai faction, as they're often referred to. And they were
Hmm.
actually, when it came to China's most recent zero COVID policy, zero COVID policy, whatever, they were the primary ones targeted. Shanghai was
Yep.
a big target for lockdown, and they were also a lot of the ones promoting, say, these LGBTQCIA clinics,
Yep.
the ones
Yep.
promoting this subversive stuff in the media. Whereas you've had a campaign since 2017 from this other faction, the Xi Jinping faction now, whether they're based out of Beijing or wherever, I couldn't tell you that much about internal Chinese politics, but they're the ones who have been retiring officials. I believe it was Hu Jintao, who was the former president of China, was just completely sidelined at the last party congress and was made to look like a complete fool man who was president of China for about a decade. And I think he was president after Deng Xiaoping, or I could have the timeline off a bit, but he was uh, one of the most recent presidents. He's 96 now, so he's up there in years, but and so are a lot of the party officials because that's the way those kind of regimes just tend to work out. But that's aside the point. But China had taken that direction over the past 5 and approaching 6 years at this point. So there's been that fundamental change. This is certainly not the China that, say, Lula would have been dealing with in the late 2000s, early 2010s during his first stint in office. And especially with the dynamic of the restructuring of the system in Hong Kong with a more or less direct Chinese control over it, the tensions regarding Taiwan, and especially now with the growing partnership with Russia and the divisions of the world that have taken place as a result of the Russia Ukraine war. The dynamics are very different, and in which case, like a lot of other leftists, when faced with these sort of decisions, will likely embody a lot of the transformations that happened from the 2000s left in America. Not that they were some great bash, and not that they would have run America right or had the right ideas, but what happened with Lula and what you're going to see happen with Lula and his ilk is you're going to see that initial momentum they had from that late 2000s, early 2010s transformed once again into that LGBTQ CIA American empire left. Not that they weren't already, but it's going to be a complete subjugation of that, especially in wake of how Russia and China have changed in the course of the past decade.
Right. You know, we always joke that America will is becoming like Brazil, and it's in fact Brazil becoming more like America. Um, yeah, I see the same thing. I think Lula is. I mean, I think he's done. First of all, he's quite old. Um, he's a very easy guy to get rid of if you had to. If the system had to get rid of him for one reason or another, let's say he starts becoming very cozy with both Russia and China. There's a lot on him for them to get rid of him. He's known for being an alcoholic. Um, he's very very malleable, and I'm sure that there are a lot of Americans already um, in Brazil that are overseeing a lot of this. I have no doubt about that.
Slip
Um,
some bribes to
you could
judges, put him back in prison if he gets out of line, that sort of thing.
right, and you see the same thing being played out in the U.S. and Biden's little red Corvette. Like, it's so preposterous. They just found these documents, right? Again, if the system has to get rid of like one of their own, including guys like Jeff Epstein, now it's been like declared that he was a sex trafficker and so on. Um, that has more to do. I was telling Constantine off air that I watched the interview between Matt Taibbi and the Gray Zone, and it was really, really good. I highly recommend watching it, especially if you want to get your toes a little bit wet with the most ridiculous conspiracy theory of the last 50 years, which is Russiagate. Um, Very much worth a listen. So the Gray Zone and Matt Taibbi. Um, Anyhow, I would say that that this sting that we're seeing against Biden is obviously they don't want Biden to run in 2024. They don't believe he's viable. Of course, he's determined. That could be the drugs, his anti-aging drugs, talking. Who knows? But they don't want him because, like, they find the first batch. A day later or two, they find the second batch. Well, Lula will be like that. Lula will be very easy to manipulate. I would look to see who would replace Lula than Lula himself. That's those are my tea leaves regarding Brazil.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that, and I think you bring up an interesting point that I had not originally considered, that the gerontocracy model, to borrow a term from the 70s and 80s analysis of the Soviet Union, where they will put these men who are quite a bit over the hill in power. So they're more pliable. It's understood that they probably aren't going to live much longer because, once again, a lot of them are pushing 80, if not already over that 80 mark. And although you may think of old demented men as people who are rather belligerent, which is true, which they can also use to their advantage, they are very pliable people. A lot of people tend to tune out at that point when, I mean, just taking America, for example, the political climate here. So many people have tuned out of politics since Biden has gotten elected because they just view him as the crazy old man in office right now. And that is probably the way they're going to proceed forward because, number one, all the people who still haven't gotten their taste of that power yet, who are still there, who have refused to retire. I mean, just look at the average age of Congress in the U.S. I'm sure the average age of a politician in Brazil probably isn't much better. And once again, it gets back to the thing. They're entrenched, they're established, they're stuck in their ways. So they're more or less going to make all the right decisions when you actually put them in that position. Unless their minds are completely gone, they're pretty reliable assets. In which
Yeah.
case, even if you do have to shuffle them out one term after another, for example, if something were to happen to Biden, if he were to have a health issue or he were to croak tomorrow, and of course not be able to run again because of that, I'm sure they have no shortage of comparable people both here, Brazil, and all across the world to meet up for that. So it is interesting because when it comes to the entrenching of the establishment, aside from somebody like Macron,
Mhm.
they all are pretty aged. And in terms of the next generation of leadership, now, I cannot speak for the United States because we actually don't see that much of the upswell of the younger generation. The ones that are, I suppose, somebody like Cortez would be the standard bearer for that. In just about every way imaginable. Hard left, Democrat, woman, annoying, not very intelligent. All the things that
Yeah.
you would look for in a leader. I imagine they have that. I mean, come to think of it, I suppose someone like Annalena Baerbock is just like
Mm.
AOC with about 15 more IQ points and actually given a position of real influence. So you can look forward to that kind of leadership in the West over the next 15, 20 years, in my estimation. Once the force
Oh
of
yeah, we're going to see a lot more girl bosses
oh,
in Western politics.
girl boss Caesars, I told you that
Girl
was.
boss Caesars. I love that.
I told you that was going to be the future all the way back in March 2021. Every one of you laughed at me, you scoffed at me, you disbelieved me. But once
You were
again,
right.
another war report vindication on the record. Girl boss Caesarism will be the future, and frankly, this is the fate we've consigned ourselves to. And hopefully they reflect what you'd expect out of women in leadership and aren't too competent because the more dysfunctional things are, strangely enough, actually the less the pressure is going to be just on the average everyday people who actually make up a functional society. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah. Y- one of the things I think that are going to remain constant in Brazil is, uh, just the level of violence in that society. I mean, police violence, but I also mean like non-police social violence.
Like the kind of stuff going in Mexico right now, if you want a good example.
Yeah, like it doesn't matter. Uh, it doesn't matter whether it's a Lula or a Bolsonaro. Um, I don't know if people saw the cops showing up um, at the protest on after January the 8th. Well, it was still January the 8th, and maybe some of it trickled over into January 9th. But like, they're literally trying to steer their cars, into the crowd. But you also saw, from a few hours earlier, people like, grabbing policemen off their horses and beating them with sticks. Like, that is still going to be there. It does not matter whether Lula or Bolsonaro is going to be in power. The most significant thing about Brazil is how whatever part of it can interface with either the Western powers or China is going to matter. But the other stuff is it's irreparable. It's not going to. I don't believe it's going to change.
Ironically enough, and I know you touched on this earlier, while America's future may be Brazil, just as equally, Brazil's future is America.
Yes.
And I mean, there's going to be a convergence between the two nations soon, where they are. I mean, I've previously said, and I think, and this was years ago. I think I might have to retract the statement that out of all the nations of the world, the one that bears the most resemblance to America is Australia. But I retract that and say it's Brazil without question, down to the foundation, down to how it's structured, down to its history. That they are very similar nations in that regard, and I can see nothing but perpetual dysfunction in the future of either of these nations. And
Hmm.
I mean, I suppose none of us can truly see the future, but when you look at some of the crises faced by a nation like, say, Russia or China, or even Europe, despite the fact that it seems to be in a terminal decline, you can see a pretty straightforward picture, or about a few options. You can see straightforward possibilities when it comes to the futures of nations like that. And I would even include something like Turkey, Iran, and some of these more secondary and tertiary places like that. But when you look at a
Hmm.
country like America, you look at a country like Brazil, it's almost impossible to say what's going to happen next in either of those.
Right. I mean, we can, as we have forecasted the a few things. Like I say, Lula. I think if the Russians or and Chinese are waiting for something great to develop there, there's no way that I think it's going to happen. The Americans will just not let it happen. It doesn't matter if they contradict themselves from 5 years ago. That's not important. It never has been. Um, because at the end of the day, it's always about friend enemy distinction. And at this point, China is an enemy of the U.S., so they'll do what has to be done. I always bring it up, but like the shit libs didn't want to take Trump's vaccine. As soon as Biden was elected, the vaccine was safe and reliable. So there you go. And it wasn't just influencers on Twitter that were saying that. Those were Democrat politicians who were saying that.
Yeah,
And
those were
it just
the
so the same thing
experts.
will happen.
But yes, I agree. And speaking of China, I do have a bit of news out of Asia here for some of the stuff that we didn't get to. So, you do have several nations now reintroducing mandatory testing for entrance, but not on a general scale, but particularly for China.
Hmm.
And I know that there were a few nations in Europe that did this. I think the US is considering doing this, and that's because of the new outbreaks that they say are happening in China right now. And while many fear this may be the resurgence of a 2.0 or 3.0 movement when it comes to lockdowns, mandates, and all that kind of stuff, while I do think that's a very real possibility, and while I do think that's something we certainly need to be aware of and be on our toes about, I think what we're witnessing right now is a diplomatic move, something that is supposed to divide the two poles further. And it actually does remind me of an example from what China did in some of the initial phases of the lockdowns and the outbreaks, where I'm sure some of you remember the story about uh, doing COVID tests with anal swabs. I'm sure some of you remember that.
Oh my gosh.
Now, while I don't think that it will be that on a regular basis, especially not for everyone, I do think it is going to be one of these things that we can use to hamstring, that the West will start to use to hamstring officials from China, officials from Russia, and I think China in particular with this because of the questions about the Wuhan lab and all those sort of things that arose. But I do foresee them using these new emergency medical powers that have been given to states seemingly since 2020 onward in order to play these political games. Now, they always have played political games, these, no doubt about that. Just look at 2020, look at the BLM riots, look at the some of the events towards. I mean, just look at the entire year from February onward, if you really just want to put it simply. But you're going to see that weaponized on a whole new level when it comes to diplomatic relations and how countries, and once again returning to Brazil, how countries that are on the fence, that play both sides, are going to be treated by each respective side. And like I said, while I do think it's a very real possibility they do try to shove this down our throats again, what I see right now out of this is something that they now have a blank check to pull these sort of drastic moves when it comes to foreign diplomats and foreign officials that they haven't been able to justify in previous years, but now have full license to. But insofar as what will come out of the new outbreaks in China, I think it'll really just depend on how the public reacts to it and how the media class reacts to it, and it's something they're going to play by ear. Either they're going to use this as one of those things where they say, "Oh, it's over, we're out of the crisis now," or "We're actually there's not a light at the end of the tunnel. We need to do X, Y, and Z again." Now, I think with how catastrophic the failure were to implement things like the mandates, and that ultimately ending with Fauci retiring at the end of 2020. For the time being, I think that ship has sailed. I don't think they're going to try anything like that. Now, of course, they do have other plans to extract what they want, even by, let's just say, less than honorable means. But in terms of a repeat of, say, 2020 to 2022, I don't think that's on the table for the time being.
Yeah, I mean, I always thought that Shanghai, the way they dealt with COVID there, where a part of the city would be active, the other part then would be in lockdown. Then 2 weeks later, it would switch. Um, you can develop all kinds of theories about why it had to go that way in particular. I've always maintained that they wanted to squeeze the power that was against Beijing there. They wanted to make it suffer. This is why it wasn't a nationwide thing, and you can see that the shit libs in the West, along with like the so-called right in the West, immediately started cheerleading in that kind of Tucker Carlson kind of China bad, like almost like it's just so stupid. I can't believe there are still people who think like China and Biden, and it's really dumb. But um, people don't, especially here, right? Like people are quite unconscious how strong the Homo economicus identity really is, right? And so they believe that governments would not interfere with economies. They would try to keep that at a minimum because it's all about the market, and because the market is this great determiner of what happens. Like nothing could be more untrue. I suppose it's a lot of the people who believe "go woke, go broke" is actually valid. So yeah, I mean, a hilarious um, headline that I remember seeing a few weeks ago. I don't know if it was The Economist or not, but it was something along the lines of um, yes, it's COVID is China's price for rejoining humanity. That was a an opinion piece written by Holman W. Jenkins Jr. For the Washington for the Wall Street Journal. It's like what an outrageous headline. COVID is China's price for rejoining humanity. Like um I don't know why people have all kinds of like elaborate theories, the thing is any power structure has some kind of limits, right? And just because they seem to be working does not mean that it's peaceable. But people can't understand that. People are invested in this idea of total power all the time. Because they're invested in that idea that everyone is in on it, and um, it's all an elaborate theater because they're afraid of who. Like, well, they don't need to make elaborate theaters. They have their own inner rivalries, right? Anyways, I won't go into that rant again.
Yeah, and you've gone on it plenty. I think you make very good points every time, but yeah, the idea that the sort of theater that we see on a domestic level in the U.S. and many other nations is transposed onto an international theater. Now, while there have been times where something like that may have happened,
Yeah,
this isn't one of them. You can clearly see the
you can see that between
diverging
Europe and the
instance.
U.S. That's
Um,
what 2022 was about.
oh yes, yes. But yeah, you can see the clear diverging interest between the multiple blocks of power when it comes to that, and they're not all shaking hands and having martinis in the back room like many people like many people believe. Now, a few years ago, like early 2000s, they would have been, but things have changed drastically since then. So
Yeah,
it's
you had
yeah,
that uncertainty after the um, after the fall of the Soviet Union. So
in a certain twist of irony, a lot of people's minds are still ruled by globalism in the sense they truly can't imagine a divided world. Even when they do see these things play out, even when they may at least theoretically agree with us, they can't bring themselves over the hump that, wow, maybe there are actually multiple power blocks in the world now. Maybe it's no longer the global cabal that it once was. So, it, I mean, it's understandable for a lot of people taking their first dive into this, but yeah, the perception of some sort of elaborate theater uh, to hide from the masses of the people to stop them from rising up is pure fantasy, for lack of a better term.
yeah, because we went through a period where it was quite there's many pieces people can read about how well the piece that you read. Um, we're not going to make the same mistakes we made in 1991. It was uncertain, right? A big power block challenge to the U.S. had had disappeared, and you gave it, and really, like after 2 decades, it was obvious that another power block would develop and things would go back to the way they were.
Yeah, and I think once again that's a notion that has occupied a lot of people's minds that it will take quite a while for them to get over if they actually ever end up getting over it. But the last thing I had for today was some recent news out of Lithuania and Latvia.
Hmm.
There was a reported explosion that rocked a pipeline between the two nations, and it rocked the Amber Grid. And the operator of the grid, the chief executive, Munas Biknius, has said that there's no lasting damage to it. There was an explosion that caused a small fire, and that the pipeline should be online and fully functional within 2 to 3 days. So,
If you saw the videos, I don't know if you did you see the videos of the fire? It
oh yes,
was massive.
and they haven't done anything with this yet, but of course the Nord Stream attacks are the most obvious, and then there was an attempt to sabotage on Turk Stream, among other pipelines. That this has become a common trend that damage is being done to pipelines, whether that be through deliberate sabotage or whether that just be through weak infrastructure or malfunction. Because there was actually an incident a few weeks after Nord Stream about issues with the U.S. pipeline. I mean, now that could have just been a story saying like, "Oh, the Russians are trying to get our pipeline after blowing up their own pipeline." But then there was also that story from 2021 about the pipeline grids just going offline, similar to how U.S. air travel just went offline earlier this week on Tuesday and Wednesday, where the systems were just down and would not function in order to get flights off the ground, which going further into American infrastructural failure, that's just another example you can add to the mountain of examples we already have. But there was this explosion. There were the images and videos of the fire, which looked a lot worse than it turned out to be. And now you have the officials who are running the pipeline coming out and saying this is going to be back online. There's no evidence we found of sabotage thus far. They didn't even imply that they were going to launch a further investigation into sabotage, which makes me think that yes, this actually was a genuine accident. This wasn't
Yeah.
either a Russian sabotage or a false flag of a Russian sabotage in order to justify further intervention into Ukraine. Now, the most conspiratorial take I can have on this, because I know that's why you all come here, I know you come here for those kind of takes, is that this was a test for an operation that they were going to run sometime in the near future. That they were seeing how much damage can we do to this and keep it still operational while being able to pin it on the Russians, which between the videos, now that could have just been camera angles, that could have just been, a lot of people don't know how pipelines work. Admittedly, I'm not an expert on the actual functionality of pipelines. So when the damage and the explosion and the fire, that all sounds scary, that all looks sensationalized for the media, but then the damage is actually relatively minimal. Although, once again, I can't speak to how that damage would actually play out and how that would actually look on camera and how that would actually look from an outsider's perspective versus an insider's perspective. But with that, the furthest I can stretch this is that they are plotting some sort of attack on a pipeline in Europe in order to blame Russia in order to escalate the war. But I'm not even going to co-sign onto that. I just want to put that out there as, again, the most I can stretch this logic, the most I can make out of the story in true journalist fashion.
Yeah, it's a possibility. It's a possibility because now I don't know how much mileage they're going to get out of this because the first one is what was wildly unsuccessful. Maybe it was successful for the first month or two, but there were doubts, and now they've come out and said it wasn't Russia. Everybody knows it was either the U.S. or someone on the behest of the U.S. who did this with Nord Stream. So, uh, you know, I don't know if this pipeline in any way links up with Kaliningrad, but my bet would be they do something to cut off Kaliningrad as a form of escalation. Because now I think with the fall of Solidar, and we also have news that Opitne in the southern suburb of Bakhmut has been completely taken, and the Russians are making more advances in the north. Um, and there's a lot of cope right now denying that Solidar has fallen. Uh, they really don't have a plan about how to break the bad news. I think a lot of people from September to November believed that Ukraine was going to not lose another city or town, and it would be a success all the way. Sometime in 2023, that it would just be a matter of time, right? Um, as as Russia progresses and let's say becomes more successful, because I think even in the Kharkov uh, Liman direction on the west side of Lugansk, um, those efforts by the Ukrainians to take Crimea have been unsuccessful. And now, with the fall of Solidar, encirclement in the Seversk region, which is just south of the region that I'm talking about, and is an important supply route, right? That could be more difficult. So I guess as they if it looks like Russia is going to win this, right? They they have to escalate. Now, they've already tried Transnistria and Kaliningrad. That doesn't mean they won't try those areas again. I think they will. They'll have to go for it. Simply because the amount,
There were already
just the
murmurs out of Moldova about requesting, or more accurately, demanding Russian presence leaves Transnistria. So that could be potential. And then you had the news from a few months ago where there were joint operations between Romania and Moldovan forces in the event that anything in Transnistria would escalate. So that is also another possible front they're gearing up for. The situation in the Balkans only does continue to boil over day by day, And then once again, you have Kaliningrad, and then you also have the possibility of somewhere like Kazakhstan or the Caucasus as well.
Right, and Russia, just to mention another front, America rather, has emphatically stated that it will not support any country that normalizes relations with Assad, and that includes Turkey. America has also made a demand that Turkey will not receive new F-16 fighter jets um, unless it uh, votes in favor of Finnish and Swedish ascension into NATO. So, um, because there are going to be meetings between Assad and Erdogan in Moscow to create some kind of a peace agreement, which would involve Turkey pulling out of these areas. That will throw the ball into the Americans' court, and they will have to act. They will have to increase troop presence there because without the Turks there and without the Turks funding for like some of these um, jihadist groups in northern Syria, they have been on the attack. They've committed more attacks against the Syrians. Last week there was a Syrian officer who was executed. An attack on uh, by ISIS against Syrian forces, which killed something like 13 or 14 Syrian army members and about 3 or 4 ISIS members. So they're not going to let up. The U.S. is going to make sure that in certain areas of Syria, not all areas, but in certain areas of Syria, ISIS is successful, but not in the areas that the Kurds control or the Americans control. So yeah, that's another front that could be developing. Um, you know, Turkey has discovered gas deposits in the Black Sea. There's the whole project of making Turkey an engine or a hub of energy transport to Europe. So there's all kinds of things that are happening right now, which would ask the Americans to give extra attention than they already have been in this theater. And like I say, I think that if there's there are just so many political careers at stake right now, right? That if Russia, like if they take the Donbass, that in itself will be so crushing. They don't have to take the other regions, but if they take the Donbass, that will be so crushing to both the Ukrainians and the U.S. and the Europeans that I don't know. I don't know what they will do because when the Pentagon and some of these other bodies, military bodies within the U.S. Elite structure, they've never been in favor of a war in Ukraine for various reasons. Arming Ukraine, training Ukrainians is one thing, but involving themselves in a war directly in Ukraine has not been something that they've wanted. However, every time since '63 that it has become a showdown between the Pentagon and the president, the president has won. And if the president says they're going to go in since '63, they usually go in. And yeah, I don't know what they'll do, but that's one of the things I'm afraid that they'll do.
Now, just on that note, I do want to continue on just because you brought up a few points I wanted to address there. So, starting with the point about the Pentagon versus the president and the political interest there. Now, you brought up the interesting fact that I didn't know that apparently, when it comes to those disputes between the president and the Pentagon, ever since 1963, the president always comes on top. Now, I'm not saying we're going to see a subversion of that trend anytime soon, but I think that we are closer to a subversion of that than we have
Mm.
been in since 1963. I'll put it that way. There is also news from the Secretary of the Navy who claimed that the U.S. needs to choose between arming itself or Ukraine for the next 6 months. And this is just a direct quote from the Secretary of the Navy, Carlos del Toro. Very American name. I wouldn't say we're quite there yet, but if conflict does go on for another 6 months, for another year, it certainly continues to stress the supply chain in ways that are challenging, which could just mean it's a cry for help for more funding to the U.S. military with budget disputes and everything that goes on in Washington. Or it could be a signal of genuine concern that this war needs to either be won fast or abandoned, which is rhetoric that you seldom hear out of the U.S., seldom hear out of Washington. Now, this is the Secretary of the Navy who is an appointee of the president, so it would fall under the same branch as the president versus the Pentagon, more on the side of the president as somebody who works directly under him. And then you brought up some stuff about Turkey that I just wanted to briefly touch on. And with the seeming normalization of relations with Syria and the subsequent threats, although I would say it's been obvious for quite some time now, at this point the American empire has chosen to completely forsake Turkey, which is a very risky move because of the structure of NATO, that Turkey was always supposed to be that dagger underneath Russia, that was always supposed to be that springboard if any action were needed to be taken against Russia. But because of how desperate the situation is somewhere like Ukraine, and as you said, even if they take the Donbass, who knows what the reaction will be, that no amount of dissent can be tolerated, no amount of deviation can be tolerated, even from a piece of the puzzle as vital as Turkey when it comes to that even they have to be punished, even they have to be marginalized, even they have to be sidelined. And I've been saying for years that when NATO kicks out Turkey, NATO is finished as an organization. It cannot function otherwise as an
Hmm.
organization.
Hmm.
And right now, what they're pushing.
They'll have to go to war.
Oh, absolutely. And right now, what they're pushing to no strategic sense, even from the diabolical minds of the American Empire, that Finland and Sweden are a worthwhile trade off for Turkey. That countries that are practically already integrated into the American Empire's military system, into NATO's military system, it is worth giving them official NATO membership. It is worth that pissing contest, even if it means isolating Turkey and putting them firmly on the side of Russia for the foreseeable future and firmly divorced from Europe. As they've continued to marginalize them from Europe, as they've continued to marginalize them from NATO, it will drift eastward. Now, I don't say this on a great love of Turkey. I actually think that despite its more recent sane moves, it is not a power that I think Russia or Syria should be welcoming with open arms. Not that they are, but I still think that it needs to be treated with a great degree of skepticism and, frankly, mistrust because of how erratic the nation has been. Because, especially once Erdogan's out of power, it could default right back into the West. So, it's a very volatile player to deal with, which the West is taking the completely wrong approach to. Now, you see the exact opposite with, say, Russia and Syria, where they are taking a very measured approach to this. They are getting progress done, and they are seeing withdrawal of Turkish forces from Syria and the normalization of relations. And then to top it all off, to say that we're going to sanction any nation that tries to normalize with Syria, a conflict that is, let's see, at this point, almost 12 years old, in which case the government of Syria, Assad, is still in power. It is far from the area it was in 2014 when it was just barely holding on to power, to the point where the regime has more or less stabilized the country, aside from the withholding of grain and oil and other natural resources by the leftover American occupation troops. It is a complete purity spiral is the only way I can put it with the way the American
Hmm.
empire is behaving. A complete purity spiral that they're willing to jeopardize one of the most important players in their global strategy, especially regarding Russia, over what are seemingly such minor things. And I think that's really exemplified how much the dynamics changed with Turkey with the gas hub. Now, I do think that is also a bit of a risky move on, say, Russia's part, because they're giving the same nation that will amass migrants on the European border and use that to a great degree of blackmail. They're giving them the same power to do that with energy resources, which, given Russia's current relations with the European Union and European states in general, may be wise. But when it comes to a long term strategy, I'm not saying that Turkey's inevitably going to betray Russia, but they are once again a very volatile player, and it does put a lot of power in their hands. But it's not like I'll be honest, at this point, with the way Russia has had it set up, it's not an opportunity they can afford to let go, even with all the risk involved. But when it comes also to gas hubs, you do see the U.S. setting up the promised LNG ports. They're starting to set those up in Spain, and they're using Spain as a gas hub from the Atlantic to the continent. So you're seeing these rival blocks built. And actually, LNG has gone down as a result of some of the American shipments that have arrived in Europe. Now, how long it'll stay down and how much the U.S. will actually be able to provide long term, those questions remain to be answered. But it does appear that just on the two edges of Europe, you're going to get LNG flooding in from both sides, and you're going to get a proper energy war. Now, maybe
Mm.
we're already in the middle of a full-blown energy war, but it's if we're already in one, it's going to escalate greatly, and that pipeline sabotage, such as what we saw with Nord Stream, such as the attempts on Turk Stream, is likely going to become the norm in the next 5 to 10 years.
Right. In America's shale industry is it was becoming completely relevant by 2019. COVID came along. We did that episode in the spring that showed what an effect it had, and how like nearly of these little shale companies just went bust. They haven't turned a profit. I think for now, America can, as a policy to win over support in Europe, bring down the cost of LNG, but LNG is always going to be far more expensive. And it, we'll see how successful it is. Now, they will never replace in quantity or in price the Russian gas, which ultimately means. But America will have to very, very rapidly industrialize to make it. So we'll see. We'll see if they can pull it off. So far, it doesn't look that way.
Now,
But
the last thing I'll leave you with on that topic
the
and for this episode is the overlooked third front of energy resource to Europe that is not the U.S., that is not Russia. Now, I'm not saying that Russia can be supplanted for the reasons that you were touching on, that Russia, in terms of quantity and price, are able to output it farther than, say, the U.S. can, but there was also that project, which goes back to the situation in Libya, between Egypt, Israel, Cyprus, and Greece in Italy, that Mediterranean project to try to get the energy from there into there, which Turkey, along with their proxies in Libya, stood directly in opposition to. And now with them becoming an energy hub, that opposition is only going to be further galvanized. So you will likely see American support thrown
good
behind
point.
that Eastern Mediterranean energy project that was scrapped a few years back because Trump wasn't willing to throw support behind it because he wanted to maintain some semblance of a balance of power in Europe and didn't want to encroach too much on the Russians. But now that Turkey is, at least insofar as energy is concerned, cast their lot incomplete with the Russians, whether that be Biden, whether that be a subsequent administration, they are going to support a project either like that, if not that project in particular. And I mean, the output that it's going to be is not going to supplant either the
Not
U.S.
at
or
all.
Russia, but it is going to be something that takes away from it, which every little bit they can take away, they're going to take. And
Yeah.
before, say in 2019 when this originally was supposed to happen, that would have just been a petty provocation but petty provocations are just business as usual in the post-Ukraine invasion world.
Yeah, I think in many ways now, in hindsight, destroying Libya was probably something it had to do with that, to prepare for the inevitable, right? Because frankly, Libya only like that only transpired about 3 years before the beginning of Maidan in Kiev at November 2013. So they're not that far off,
Oh no, between the energy implications, the migrant
2 years.
crisis, the destruction of Libya was a probably one of the most significant moves in subjugating Europe since World War II.
Yeah.
Which, in hindsight, it's very easy to see why Obama took the approach he did in Libya, why the U.S. took the approach it did in Libya. Whereas at the time, especially when people had a, let's just say, much more optimistic view of the world situation in general, it was a completely incoherent move. Where looking at it in, let's say, what we're about 12 years hindsight with that, you know, 11 and a half, 12 years around there, it makes perfect
Yeah.
sense. It was especially with the timing with the Maidan, with the timing with the Arab Spring, with the timing of the Russian actions in Ukraine, and with the timing of the migrant crisis. It was really one of the final moves put in place to make sure Europe stays subjugated, make sure it stays internally divided, and make sure its energy access is very tightly controlled.
Yeah.
But that's all I had for this shorter edition of the War Report. If you have any final comments or stories, certainly. But
Uh, um, Not really, not really. I'll just say that it's been hilarious. I can't put any kind of input in Twitter, but I'm seeing a lot of the seething and coping uh, it, on Twitter over the recent developments in Solidar. One of the ones that stood out for me, of course, was let me find it here. It was yes, Julian Ropske. Uh, so what happened was he, in pursuit of the truth, he wanted to understand where the fighting was. This is, I think, back on the 11th of, so it's about 2 days ago. I'm not sure, but he says verified pro-Ukrainian AFO activists are calling for my execution because I geolocated footage the Ukrainian army and Ukrainian soldiers published via social media. This is going too far, guys. I don't care if you disagree with me, but demanding to get me shot is wow. It is extremely fanatical. Like this war has a very chaotic, fanatical quality to it, and there's absolutely there can be no tolerance. It really is another Western Crusade, um, in the sense that liberalism has always been America's religion, its civic religion, and it can't lose. It just it's inconceivable. And, so you have like this moment of it's a war that really shouldn't matter, right? Like um, for the U.S. anyways. Um, but they've turned it into a war that is supposed to be existential for the U.S. Reputationally, it is, but not necessarily in any other respect, because of course America is so rich in resources in a way that Europe isn't.
oh no,
It doesn't have to worry.
in terms of raw self-interest, if you had a North American polity that was actually ran by North Americans who valued their homeland, it would be a quasi isolationist state, and in my opinion, it should be. It has the resources to sustain itself. Now, I'm not saying it needs to be completely closed off from the outside, but with the real geographic blessings that, say, a country like America is given, it should be able to take a very detached role in relation to the rest of the world.
Mhm.
But since it has tied itself to number one, the ideological crusade, and number two, just the. In many ways, I would suppose it's just a quest for glory, a real just international pissing contest. Really, the only way I can put it. That it has embroiled itself in all of these different conflicts, and the fact that it outsourced so much and it relied made itself so reliant on foreign resources that this war has become paramount. Now, if Russia does succeed in this war materially, things probably will get a bit tighter in the Western world, although they're going in that direction anyway. It would just exacerbate the current tensions. But at the end of the day, the American empire needs to be so dedicated to this war because it is the wedge they can use to drive a an ocean-sized rift between Russia and continental Europe, which is the combination that they have feared, the combination that the Anglo-Americans have feared since the 19th century, if not even before then.
I suppose there is actually, just to stay on topic. There are one or two last things I'll say about the conflict in Ukraine, and that
Okay, go
is,
yeah, go ahead.
as part of the copium, the Ukrainians are hoping that there's this horrible dispute brewing between Prigozhin and Putin over the success of Wagner in Solidar. There's not like this is so idiotic. There is not a rivalry. Uh, Putin doesn't care. Um, it's not going to split the government. Putin is not going to. The Jerusalem Post had a headline: "Putin afraid of coup will leave office this year." So,
Patriots in
uh,
control. Source
source my
military.
imagination. Yeah, so it's so ridiculous. Uh, the fact is, it took many months, but really after um, Bakhmutskoye, which is a suburb of Solidar, but not Bakhmut, the city. Um, it's attached to Solidar. Like the LPR and the Wagner forces took that, but it was yeah, sure. Prigozhin wants to brag about how Wagner completely did this. They encircled the Ukrainians. Well over 100 have already surrendered, and I would say at least 100, based on the videos I've seen, have been killed. The Ukrainians made an attempt to recapture it. The Russians have taken or are about to take a train station called Sol. This is a railway line that goes from Bakhmut north all the way to Seversk, and it's at the western tip of what is Solidar. So, and of course, I'll bring up Arestovich again. He said, "We are in control. If we leave Solidar, that means we're in control. We've made that decision."
I think
He just never disappoints, that
I
guy.
think I
He
would
just
rather have this show end no other way than with an
yes.
Arestovich reference. And thank you for that. I'm glad they're making a comeback because he went silent for a while. And thank you all for tuning into this a little bit shorter edition of the War Report, letting us clean up some of the news that we didn't quite get to a few days back. And we will see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.